Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
And I'm Leslie Finger. In this segment, we'll talk about experiments and quasi-experiments that evaluate merit pay. For those of you who want to learn more about these methods, we would suggest you go to parts 3 and 4 of the methods lecture. Paul, we've heard arguments for and against merit pay, but what does the research actually say about the effects of merit pay on student achievement?
There are relatively few studies of merit pay within the United States, but there are 3 that are worth looking at. One is an evaluation of a group incentive plan in New York City. Another evaluates Michelle Rhee's efforts in Washington, D.C. And the third is a small but fascinating experiment in Illinois.
Let's begin with the group incentive plan in New York City. What was that performance pay plan like?
In New York City, the school district and the teacher union agreed on a trial performance pay plan, but only for those schools that agreed to participate. The teachers had to vote in favor of it. The bonus money was going to be paid out to everyone in the school so that you wouldn't get competition among the teachers. And the teachers would be allowed to determine how the money was divided.
And how was the study designed?
It was designed as an experiment. Half of the schools who were willing to participate were given the opportunity to get the bonus, and the other half were not. And so that way you could compare 2 groups of schools that were equally interested in participating, but only half of them actually did.
And what did the study find?
Well, the evaluation showed that these group incentives did not have the positive effect on merit pay that was expected.
But were there problems with this study? I mean, can we really be sure that group incentives do not increase student achievement?
Well, I personally don't believe these results because the study was well designed, I'll admit that, but there was something that came up at the time the experiment took place that really nobody could do anything about. The state lowered its definition of what it was to be proficient as a student, and that's what the teachers are going to be given a bonus according. So it became really easy for every school, just about, to show that it had met its target. And so most of the schools in both the treatment group and the control group showed these required gains. So really, the study is not definitive.
Okay, let's talk about the merit pay plan in Washington, D.C. How did that plan come into being?
Well, that was the result of an incredible battle between the teacher union in Washington, D.C. and the new administration led by Michelle Rhee, who was a strong proponent of performance pay. And in the end, this is such a battle that it costs Michelle Rhee her job, but the performance pay nonetheless does get instituted as part of a broad compromise. So it's an incredibly interesting story to look into.
How was the DC plan designed?
Well, teachers were evaluated according to both student test results and direct observation. So that added legitimacy to the merit pay plan because the teachers were being directly observed. It wasn't just on the basis of test scores alone. The teachers were divided into 4 groups: highly effective, effective, minimally effective, and ineffective teachers. The highly effective teachers got a large increase in salary if they remained effective the following year. The ineffective teachers could be dismissed. The minimally effective teachers had to prove themselves to be effective the next year, or they too were at risk of being dismissed. So you had a chance to see in this situation whether or not teachers will improve if they get a higher salary, and whether or not teachers will improve if they are threatened with dismissal.
And who took advantage of this chance? What researcher evaluated this program?
Well, Thomas Dee of Stanford University's Graduate School of Education did the study, and he talked with me in a conversation that will appear at the end of this lecture.
And how did Dee design the study?
Tom designed the study as a quasi-experimental study known as a regression discontinuity study, and as Leslie said, be sure to take a look at this in the methods lecture. Essentially what he did is he looked at the teachers who were barely classified as highly effective and compared to those who barely missed getting that ranking. And then you apply the same thing to the minimally effective teachers who barely missed being identified as effective.
Did these teachers who were at risk of losing their jobs actually improve?
Two things happened. A significant number just left teaching, about 11 percentage points higher than among those in the other group. But those who stayed improved by about 27% of a standard deviation, which is a huge improvement in teacher performance. So the threat of being dismissed if you did not improve your performance had huge consequences for teacher performance.
What about the large salary increase for those who were rated highly effective 2 years in a row that you told us about? Did they improve?
Yes, once again, the impact on teacher performance was very substantial, this time about 24% of a standard deviation. So this is the best information we have on how effective a merit pay plan might be in the United States.
But how do we interpret these findings?
First of all, Washington, D.C. is a big district, and this plan was put in place throughout the whole district. It wasn't just a small little experimental program for a few teachers. And there is no other merit pay plan that's ever been tried out in a big district that's as thoroughgoing as this. That large positive impacts were identified is quite fascinating and suggestive.
But I imagine there must be some limitations to this study.
Well, the biggest one is you can't be sure that you can apply this to all teachers. All we know is it worked for those teachers that were on the cusp of a particular category, just missing being rated as highly effective or just missing being identified as effective. So whenever you do these regression discontinuity analyses, there's always a risk that what you find for this group on the cusp isn't true for teachers in general.
Earlier in this segment, you mentioned a merit pay plan in a small Illinois suburb. What do you find interesting about that study?
Well, it is a small suburb, so you don't know quite how widely you can apply this, but Roland Fryer, an economist at Harvard, arranged for a randomized experiment in which some teachers were given a bonus in advance for bringing up students to a higher level of achievement, but the bonus would be taken out of their salary if they didn't succeed at the end of the year. Other teachers were promised the same bonus, but it didn't give it to them until the end of the year.
What's the theory behind this experiment?
Well, it comes from behavioral economics, a rapidly developing field. The theory is based on the idea that people fear losing money more than they desire getting additional money.
But how was this theory tested in this experiment?
If the theory is correct, teachers will work harder to avoid a deduction from their paycheck at the end of the year, the loss of the bonus they had already received, than they will just to get the bonus at the end of the year. If the theory is wrong, then there should be no difference between the two groups, as the bonus was the same for the two groups. So whether you get it at the beginning of the year or the end of the year should make no difference.
And what did Fryer ultimately find here?
Well, he found that the theory was correct, that the teachers who were paid up front and feared losing the pay were more effective than the teachers who only received the bonus at the end of the year if students learned more.
That's a clever experiment, but do we really expect districts to organize merit pay plans that give teachers money and then tell them they might take it away?
Good point. I think the experiment is more clever than practical. I can't imagine a school district in a collective bargaining situation getting the union to agree to that kind of an experiment.
So, Paul, what can we conclude about alternatives to the regular teacher salary schedule?
I would draw three main conclusions, Leslie. First of all, battle pay is more acceptable to teachers than either market pay or merit pay schemes. But market pay and merit pay are viable reform strategies in education. They are going to be tried out despite the strong opposition from teachers and the unions. Finally, a change in the standardized pay schedule will come only very slowly in the United States, given the intensity of the opposition. So those are the main conclusions that I would draw, but I think we should end with a conversation with Thomas Dee, professor of education at Stanford, who studied Michelle Rhee's controversial merit pay plan in Washington, D.C., and see how he interprets the effectiveness of this innovation. I have with me this afternoon Tom Dee, who's a professor of education at Stanford University. He's done a lot of work on studying how and what works effectively in education. Tom, it's great to have you with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to ask you about this really controversial program in Washington, D.C. Michelle Rhee was the chancellor there. She decided she wanted a merit pay program. She had to negotiate it with the unions. They finally got a plan agreed upon, but it was very tough politically, and she finally resigned her position when the mayor lost the next election, and a lot of people think there was a connection between all of these events. So did this merit pay plan actually work is what we want to get to, but first I would like to have you just describe what did she try to do, what did she set up, how was the program designed?
Right. Well, it was really an unusual seminal program, not only in that it provided high-powered incentives for teachers to do well, but also because of the manner in which it measured teacher performance. I think when most people popularly think of these types of reforms that have been emerging, they think of giving teachers rewards for improving students' test scores. But I think that's a misrepresentation of this program. What this program largely privileges involves direct measures of teacher practice within classrooms. The district goes to a lot of trouble to train principals and assistant principals, as well as their own central district office staff, to go into the classrooms, to sit down and observe teachers, and to try to rate them on how their professional practice accords with 9 very explicit domains for what they think constitutes effective instruction. So it's things like, do they pause during the lecture to check for student understanding? Do they have objective-driven lessons? How do they engage with students? That sort of thing.
So this is not just you go look at the test scores and say this is an effective teacher. You have to demonstrate effectiveness in the classroom to the satisfaction of these observers.
That's right, and we argue that may be a big part of the reason we find early evidence that the program was successful. There's a literature, particularly in economics, that suggests that incentives work best when people feel they have direct control over the kind of actions that will lead to a reward. And I think the concern out there is that if you're just giving teachers rewards for test scores, they don't necessarily know, what can I do tomorrow in my classroom that will allow me to earn those rewards? But they can directly control their instructional practice. So there are other things the district did in terms of implementation quality that I think made it an unusually high fidelity program. But I think some of these design features may have been really salient and distinguish it from some of the other things we've seen in the field. In the first 3 years of the program, they rated teachers on these multiple measures: classroom observation, some other principal observation of whether the teacher was a good colleague, committed to the school community, and in some cases, some test score measures, though again, they had much smaller kind of coverage of the teachers. And they took that summative score and divided teachers into 4 bins: ineffective, minimally effective, effective, and highly effective. Only around 2% or so of teachers fell within the ineffective bin, and they were immediately dismissed from the district.
So 2% of the teachers were immediately
That's right.
asked to leave.
That's right, which in and of itself made this so unusual in the field of teacher compensation, to actually have had those separation decisions. Now, for teachers in the far right tail, this is where the
right tail.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The highly
effective teachers. I
yes.
promised I wouldn't get too technical. So the highly effective teachers got really substantial bonuses on the order of $20,000 immediately. But then the thing that we really leveraged in our research design is for teachers who got that rating, they were told if you can be great again, a second year in a row, achieve a highly effective rating, we will advance you on the salary schedule by anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And if you don't already have a graduate degree, we will treat you as if you have one.
So how much does that add up to? Is
Well,
that
so
20,000, 30,000?
It
How much?
varies by teachers, but we calculated that for a teacher who was in a high poverty school who hadn't already earned a graduate degree, they could expect to get a permanent increase in their salary by being highly effective a second time on the order of $20,000 to $25,000. So we calculated in present dollars over 15 years, that was nearly $200,000.
So that sounds like something worth working for. Now, how about those minimally effective teachers?
So they faced a very different and somewhat darker incentive. They were told, look, you're not ineffective, but you're not in the effective band either. We're going to give you one more year to improve. And if you can't get yourself into the effective band or higher, then we're going to separate you from the district.
Oh, so yes, that's serious. But then that's what other people do in other occupations. They say,
Right.
You're not doing so well, you need to show better work this coming year.
Well, the other thing we emphasize about this is in its first year, teachers may not have actually seen that as a real incentive because in many ways, it probably lacked credibility. And when teachers were first told they were minimally effective was right at the time the Democratic primary election was going on. The mayor was in the process of being voted out of office. And so within months of those first minimally effective ratings, Michelle Rhee was asked to resign and the future of the entire program was in doubt. And so my co-author and I actually find that that minimally effective incentive in the first year really had no effects. And it was only when, surprisingly, the program persisted a second year, and we saw the teachers getting their minimally effective rating for the first time in that second year, that the incentive seemed to bite. Now, again, there could be any number of explanations, but we talk a lot about it may be that the policy credibility really mattered.
So how do you study this? How do you feel confident of your findings? What's your method?
Well, this is a fiendishly difficult sort of thing because the program went to scale across the district at the same moment. So in some sense, how do you form a control group for thinking about the effects of this type of policy?
I mean, there's nobody to compare them to.
There is no one really at hand. And this is where we leveraged a unique design feature of the program. Because remember I mentioned teachers are rated into these separate bins. And it occurred to us that a teacher whose rating placed them just barely in the minimally effective bin. They've got a score, it's not 250 or above, it's 249, 248, 247. They face
so they're
those strong
standing on a
incentives.
cliff, so to speak.
That's right.
They either fall off that cliff
Right.
and are rated ineffective, or they just barely made it to
Right.
effective.
And then there are teachers at 250, 251, 252 who are effective. And the point is those very local comparisons constitute a kind of as good as random assignment
You assume
experiment.
that whether they got into one or another category was pretty much like flipping a coin.
That's right. And we can do more than assume it. We can actually pressure test that sort of modeling assumption by looking at whether the traits of teachers seem balanced on either side of the threshold, or the number of teachers, are they clustering on one side versus the other?
Well, this sounds truly interesting. Now, tell me, Tom, what did you find?
Well, so interestingly, we found in the first year, the minimally effective incentive had no effect. Again, arguably when it lacked political credibility. But the second year of the program, we saw teachers who were just barely under that minimally effective threat were substantially less likely to return to the district. So we see voluntary attrition in response to the incentive of these lower
This is
performing
not a
teachers
job I'm
from the
suited
district.
for. It's
That's
time
right.
to move on.
I could see the writing on the wall. This is a durable, politically tested incentive that is not going to be accommodating to lower performing teachers. And so they merely left. And then we examined what about the performance of those who returned, and we saw a fairly dramatic and statistically significant increase in their measured performance in the coming year.
Well, thank you, Tom.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I've been speaking with Tom Dee. He's a professor at Stanford University in the School of Education.